Good morning and welcome to day 8 of Finding Joy, our study through the book of Philippians on finding joy. Today we're going to discuss and read a few verses. It'll actually be our longest passage yet, but we'll read a passage and we're going to discuss finding joy in God's calling. Let me encourage you, if you've been listening since the beginning or you're just hopping on, share these with your friends. They're pretty straightforward and simple and practical. Even have your kids watch. We're encouraging our kids to watch. We don't know if they are or not.
We can't tell, but we're hoping.
Yeah, but we're encouraging them to. But these are, this is like, Charlie Brown's teacher in their ears. They hear these voices all the time.
Wow.
And these messages. But anyway, share our talks and let's jump right in. This, like I said, it's a long passage today. Jay's going to read part of it, and then I'm going to read part of it just to kind of break it up a little bit. But it's actually Philippians 1, verses 20 through 26.
Finding joy in God's calling. Now, just so you know, we have so mystified this idea of God's call on your life. And I pray that in the next 15 minutes, that some of those layers of, that's for somebody else, that's for the super spiritual, it's not for me. We're praying that those will just come off and that you'll see God's calling is something that's for you. For every single one of you, no matter where you are, that God has a call on your life and he wants to use you. Let's hop in the scriptures. I pray and I trust you're going to find yourself in Philippians chapter 1, verse 20. If you have a Bible, get it out or print out the notes to follow along. Philippians chapter 1, verse 20, Paul writes, "For I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ, as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ, whether I live or die. For to me, living means living for Christ, and dying is even better." If you've been around church at all, for me to live and to
Is Christ.
Is Christ, and to die is gain. That's the old King James version of it. So you're probably recognizing some of these nuggets you've heard your whole time. He says, for me, living means living for Christ, but he goes, but dying's even better. Wow. He says, but if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. Can't you ever feel like this way? Like, I don't know. One of the primary questions I get asked from men and men up is, God, I want to do God's will. I want to follow his call. I want to be on mission. I just don't know what that is. And Paul says, hey, I don't really know which one's better. I see benefit in both. Verse 23, he says, I'm torn between two desires. I long to go be with Christ, which, by the way, would be far better for me. Like, if I'm just looking out for myself, I'm checking out. Listen, I know sometimes we make decisions that are selfish, and we're like, well, what's in it for me? And if we just make decisions on what's in it for me, we'll miss out on what's in it for others. Paul says, if it's up to me, I'm out. That'd be a lot better for me. He says, but for your sakes, verse 24, but for your sake, it's better that I continue to live. Wow. Look at that.
Yeah. So continuing in verse 25, it says, knowing this, I'm convinced that I will remain alive so I can continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. And when I come to you again, you will have even more reason to take pride in Christ Jesus because of what he is doing through me.
Yeah. So I love how clear Paul is. He goes, if you've ever struggled with this thing of God's will or God's call or mission, he goes, I do too. I think that brings me a lot of joy. Paul was the quintessential Christ follower. 3 missionary journeys, wrote half of the New Testament, and he's going, yeah, I struggle with that too. So we're in good company.
Yeah.
I think what's good is the struggle's real, but he just kept keeping the focus on, but what has God called me to give my life to?
Right.
What's he called me to give my life to? We've already touched on this in yesterday and some previous days. How has he gifted me?
Yeah.
Like, how has he wired me? Where has he placed me? These are all the questions that you need to ask to kind of begin to determine God's calling on your life.
So this working with students, Jay and I worked with students for 20 years before we stepped into a different role in ministry. This is a topic and a conversation that you have with teenagers so much about finding God's will. And I remember being a teenager myself in the church, and that being a huge deal, and it was a struggle because you want to get it right. And I just remember early on knowing that this is God's will, or God's call for my life is not some hidden mystery that I need to unveil or discover. Chances are, when you know God's calling on your life and you know what God's will is, it's going to be as plain as the nose on your face, because it's who you are. We talked yesterday about our gifting. You're going to see it in your gifting. So we're going to unpack it just a little bit, and we're going to ask ourselves some questions that maybe can help us reveal some of the things, and maybe specifically what God is calling you to do. Jay says this, and I love this definition, that nothing is more filling than living in God's calling. We all want to feel fulfilled, and we want to feel like we're doing our part. We want to feel important, significant, used, and all of those things come under, when we're living in God's calling, we will be filled to the brim. And I think we're going to ask some important questions that are some truths about God's calling that are going to not answer every question that you've ever had about God's calling or God's will for your life, but maybe begin to peel back some of those layers to cause you to think and cause you to see how God's calling and the gifting that we have and God's will for our lives is tied to our joy. And that was a real, when I came to know that, it was a real source of peace for me. It takes a lot of worry and concern out of finding God's will for your life.
Let me give you two questions there. I didn't put them on the sheet, but as you read this passage, the first part of the passage, Paul said, I know this. I don't know exactly how everything's going to pan out, but I know this. I'm going to give my life to honor God. I know that. And I'm going to give my life to help others. I'm going to give my life to honor God, and I'm going to give my life to help others. So in the most simple form possible, you ask two questions. You know, like, well, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do that? Should I teach there? Should I go that? Does it honor God? Yes, move forward. Is it helping others? Yes, move forward. Is it bringing me joy and bringing joy to others? See, these are the questions that help you discern this like mysterious calling. And by the way, try it. It's not like you're gonna. There's no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
Just get out there and say, I think God wants me to do this. And by the way, like we learned yesterday, or I think it was 2 days ago, Paul says, if God doesn't want me to do it, He'll stop me and redirect me anyway. And that's part of listening to God's call. Anyway,
we have two. I'll say this quickly. We have two college-age kids. I mentioned a couple days ago, their son's getting ready to graduate any day now, and we don't actually know the final day of his last day.
I don't even think he knows.
I don't think he does either.
But
it should be happening any day. But these are conversations that we have with our kids all the time, because they're at a stage in their life where they're going, okay, what does God want me to do? Well, this is so practical for us, because it's what I feel like we've been living it the last few years, even with our own children. So it's very practical. It's very, know that this one is something that is like so real and tangible to us right now.
All right, 4 truths about God's calling. Number 1, God's calling will fill you with boldness. When you're trying to do everything, you don't do anything well. When you're trying to do everything, you don't do anything well. But when you get really crystal clear, like at Man Up, it's we're here to connect men with God and other men. Once we came with clarity that we're going to use the scriptures to help men connect with God, and we're going to use the tables to help men connect with other men, it stripped away all kinds of other things that were sidetracking me and could have derailed our ministry from growing. But when you get some clarity about something, when you get clarity on your family or what's next, it fills you with extreme boldness. By the way, boldness, he says, I'm not ashamed. I watch this. Not ashamed means that it removes shame. I'm not ashamed of pursuing this thing that God's brought clearly to my life.
Right.
It gives you a lot of boldness.
Yeah. That's good. Also, God's calling. I do want to say this as we talk about getting clarity, and it takes away what is not meant for us. It doesn't mean those things are necessarily bad or not good. It is just not for us. It is not our portion.
That's right. Oh, that's a good church word right there, portion.
Yeah. So, secondly, God's calling will fill us with peace. And I think that peace is such a word that we all resonates with all of us. It's what we all want and strive for. And I think if you sit down and talk with anybody and a list of things that are important or they long to have in their life and in their family, peace is right there at the top. We have so many things that can interrupt our peace. But when we're living in God's calling, we're filled with peace. And sometimes other people, part of having that peace is other people maybe not understanding our calling. Sometimes it's our family that doesn't understand our calling. But we're filled with a peace that not, oh, I'm doing what I want to do and I don't care what you think, but a peace and a resolve that I know this is what God's called me to do. I have a peace about it. We've had a policy, if you will, in our marriage for 27 years now, that if we do not both feel peace about something, about moving forward with something, about making a decision, or that we don't move forward with it, because we know God's calling fills us with peace, and which is the opposite of worry or care or concern. And so when we're looking for God's calling, when we're testing things out, like Jay says, try it, see if it's what, and if it doesn't bring a peace to us, chances are that's not God's best for us. And so I love that, and I rest in that, and I ask God most times to give me a sense of peace about something that I'm making a decision about. Am I supposed to say yes to this? Or is this a no for now? Or so yeah, he fills us with peace and takes away the worry. It's a great indicator of God's call in our life.
Number 3, God's call will fill you with perspective. God's calling will fill you with perspective. Paul's saying, listen, if I look at what I want instead of God's call in my life, I want to be comfortable. He goes, I actually want to be dead. I want to be done with my job. It's not been an easy assignment. He goes, but the perspective is, but for your sakes, I won't quit. Because God, he recognized that his call was much bigger than his own joy or his own comfort. He knew that it was not only to have joy personally, but he knew that part of his call, he goes, I'm supposed to help you grow in your joy. I'm supposed to help you experience joy. That's part of my life, part of my calling. He says, when I have an eternal perspective, I don't have a temporary perspective.
Exactly.
I love the quote from a pastor, Andy Stanley. He says this. He says, never trade what you ultimately want for what you want right now. Never trade what it is you ultimately. He goes, get an eternal perspective, and it'll help you make eternal decisions.
Yeah.
All right, number 4.
That's good. And then lastly, God's call fills us with joy. And some people would say, oh, that's not what, following God and doing his will isn't all about happiness. But remember, we talked about that joy is different from happiness. Oh, it doesn't mean that when we are living our God-given calling that we never experience anything difficult or trials. We talked about that a couple of days ago. We do, and we will, but it brings a joy to us that is irreplaceable. And it will bring joy to us because it's what we're made to do. It's what we're created to do. And so it'll bring a sense of joy in us that many times can't be explained. It'll bring a sense of joy for us that will sustain us through hard times, will sustain us through trials. it will sustain us in the long run. And it will be our joy until we reach our ultimate joy, which is to be in the presence of Jesus. So I love that. And I love how, as we talk about God's calling as it pertains to our joy, because we always want to circle back to finding joy. When you're living in God's calling, sometimes there's no explaining it. Sometimes there's no help making other people understand it. But what is so important is that in our spirit, we sense it and we live in that and we love in that, and it's a true source of joy for us.
Yes. So let me get back to what we said just a few minutes ago. Nothing is more filling than living in God's calling. Mm-hmm. Nothing is more filling than living in God's calling. Although there'll be a lot of temptations out there that say, oh, this will fill you up. Mm-hmm. But I promise you, they'll fill you up temporarily, but not for very long. Mm-hmm. We love you guys. We love you families. We hope you're doing well. We trust that you'll live in God's call today, and we'll see you tomorrow.